say start recording. Okay.
Welcome to One Work, 5 Questions with David Dietrich and Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I am David Dietrich. I am filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly hiatus. I am a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as an amateur published historian. Mark Holacek holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He taught at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written over 26 books on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. Today's topic is a letter between Thomas Jefferson and John Wales Epps. The letter is dated 24 May, 1806. So, Dr. Holacek, if you're ready, we can get started. Question number 1.
Yeah, Jefferson and I are ready here. He's jumped up on my left. You see, we are in my posh study in London, moved to my London residence. Jefferson had a Poplar Forest. I have a London. I've never disclosed this to anybody, but just don't ask for any of the books back there because can't really get them.
As long as the spirit of Bannister Tarleton doesn't show up, right?
There you go. He might.
So would you tell the audience who was John Wales Epps and what was his association with Thomas Jefferson?
He was, Wales Epps was obviously had an Epps for a father and a Wales for a mother. So he's part of the family in some sense through the Wales. And he was born in 1772, and he married Jefferson's youngest daughter, Mary Jefferson, who went to Paris, called Mary. She came back Maria. I don't know why she got that. I guess she was called that in a convent. It could be because maybe Jefferson called her that after Maria Cosmo. Who knows? He was born in 1772, died in 1826, earlier than Jefferson. He marries Maria in 1797. He becomes a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, probably through his influence, through the influence of Jefferson. Certainly doesn't hurt. And that occurs from 1803 to 1815. I think there's a 2-year hiatus in there where he's not a representative. The two had several abortive attempts at having children, but they finally had a son, Francis Epps, who was born on 1801. Thomas Jefferson's grandson, dies in 1881, so he's 80 years of life. And Maria Jefferson Epps, who's born 1804, and she dies 2 years later in 1806. So, in effect, Mary Jefferson dies not long after giving birth to young. My pen disappears when I go off into how is that happening? It's magic. Anyways, but young Mary Jefferson Epps dies in her 2nd year, and through complications after childbirth, Maria Jefferson dies, and Francis Epps, not Francis Epps, but John Wales Epps will again marry again, right? So that's who. Francis Epps is the player here. The person to whom Jefferson is writing is John Wales Epps, who's Francis Epps' grandson's, is Thomas Jefferson. That is his son, and Thomas Jefferson's grandson. And he's writing Wales about his proposed residence in Poplar Forest. Was that confusing enough?
Absolutely. No, it's fine. That's what we had in mind. Appreciate it. Second question. What was the overall theme of Jefferson's 24 May 1806 letter to John Epps? And what does that letter tell us about the times and also Jefferson and Wales? We're thinking more of their personalities, demeanor, that kind of thing. If we can glean any of that from the letters at all. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, wow, sir, I like that. I feel important here.
Hey, you're in England, right?
That's Blimey bloke. everybody always talks about the British accent all the time. You have a decided British accent, right? And you spell a parlor, Parlour. But I like to tell people there is a British accent, and about as much as there's an American accent, there are all sorts of different sort of dialects or whatever you want it, or regional variations in how people speak it. Same with England. At least that's what the blokes in England tell you. There's no real theme. There are a couple things going on here. One of which I want to focus on. I want to focus on that he starts off talking about the leveling of Pantops. Pantops is another property, and Jefferson is thinking of building a residence there. But while he's talking about that, he's actually leveling his Bedford estate and talking about building an estate, which would become Poplar Forest, the place where you work, right? And he starts construction on that in, what is the date of the letter here? 1806. Well, that's the year he starts construction on Poplar Forest at the same time. So the second aspect of the letter worth noting is we talk about the leveling of Pantops. He writes, I'll read from the letter. With respect to a house, my former purpose had in view an object the most desirable for my comfort in the world. That has become impossible. And the object ceasing, I had retained nothing more than an indeterminate idea if our dear Francis, Jefferson's grandson, and John Wales Up's son, if our dear Francis should live, to be doing such things there at convenience hereafter as might tempt him to make it a residence. Another circumstance renders it impossible for me now to do anything beyond the leveling. I've gotten so into arrears, massively in debt, at Washington as to render it necessary for me not only to avoid new engagements, but to suspend every expense which is not indispensable. Otherwise, I shall leave that place with burthens contracted there, which, if they should fall on my private fortune, will doom me to a comfortless old age. Second thing he talks about is the connection you are about to form, and he's talking about John Wales Epps. Mary has died in 1804, and his son-in-law, John Epps, is going to marry another, and Jefferson sort of gives him the green light to do that. But the idea here, if we go back to that part of the letter, he wanted to make this house, the one that's in Poplar Forest, the most desirable for his comfort in this world. So he says it was aimed, if we take this letter, it was aimed for Jefferson's comfort, and now he has another aim in mind, right? His grandson Francis's comfort, if he should live and be interested in having. So he wants to build a house, in effect, that winds up being his getaway retreat, as well as being a possible future residence for his grandson, if his grandson should want it.
We have information related to Poplar Forest and Jefferson's specific writings in that regard. And one of the things that keeps coming out is that he kept emphasizing that I'm here to read, to write, and to think. And so that is presumably was an excellent venue for him by which he could kind of get away from it all, not for a timeshare at the beach for a week, but rather to pursue the interests of his mind, forged by not only the classics but also the Enlightenment and so forth and so on. So that all works out really, really nicely for him, I would argue, at least in the latter half of his life. 1806, by the way, 24 May 1806, in case the folks aren't aware, that he is at that point in his life, he's halfway through his second term as president of the United States. So the end is in sight in terms of the political career. I mean, it's going to be basically over in a couple of years.
Yeah, the notions that you mentioned of reading, thinking, pondering, and writing, that is Jefferson's beach vacation. Where most people would think, we'd think, well, I'm going to go to Virginia Beach and just let it all hang out, put on the suntan oil, open up a few cans of beer, have a party, eat crabs and dined. Jefferson's ideal time is to get away. He had always to have his getaway. In France, he had a little monastery to which he retreated, right, all the time. He always had to have his getaway residence everywhere he went. When he wrote the Declaration that it was at 8th and Market Street in Philadelphia, he went up to the second floor. I think he rented out the whole floor, second or third. I think it was the second. And, he focused on, sometimes he'd have his migraines when he's focusing, but nonetheless, that was time at a time when having time to yourself was so precious. That was his vacation for him. So it was good that you brought that up.
It was just kind of ironic in a way. You make that trip down from Monticello today, and it takes you about an hour and 15 minutes. Maybe a little bit quicker if you speed through Nelson County. But I wouldn't recommend that. But in his day, it took him 2 to 3 days, either by horse or carriage. Now, granted, he's making a couple stops, so that's a little bit of misleading. But still, like he mentioned, life moved at 4 miles an hour in those days, not at 65 or 85.
Yeah, it only took him 3 days, and he didn't go through Lynchburg as a lot of people think very often.
No.
But and he often would take, in his later years, he took granddaughters with him, so he had to accommodate his and of course you have to take care of the horses. You can't,
exactly.
You watch these Westerns today, and the guy gets on his horse and he takes off at a full gallop and he's going as fast, and then he's doing that for like 3 hours. Well, that's not how people traveled in the West.
Not at all.
John Wayne would never have been a good cowboy because, a 270-pound man on a horse is not a good idea when you're taking cows across a long expanse of land. The horse wouldn't like it afterwards. Anyways, that's an aside. All right, I'm ready for question 3.
Yeah, and you've kind of talked a lot of 3 already, but I'll give you a chance to add more to it if you'd like. What was the overall point of a retreat home at Poplar Forest from Jefferson's perspective, and what were his overall plans for such a facility? And when I say overall plans, not only the initial plans, but maybe, things that he had in his mind of accomplishments that he may have brought into realization or never actually got around to doing, if we know anything like that.
Well, it sounds like you have something to add to that I might. I sent you a chapter from a section from a chapter in my book on Jefferson architecture. It's from Jefferson and the fine arts. And so I have 2 sections on Poplar Forest. And I call it as architectural oddment because it really was an oddity. It was a strange building in all respects. Anyway, you look at it. The first and most obvious reason, outside of, I gave one answer. One answer was, okay, he looked at it for his own retreat. But one answer is, I'll add to the 3 I'm going to give, is that he was looking at possible residence for his grandson to stay. He wanted probably to keep knowing that his son-in-law is probably going to move away, get married, you never know, and he wanted to at least keep his grandson nearby. He let his son-in-law let Jefferson decide Francis's schooling, by the way. I have some stuff when I wrote my book on Lynchburg. Anyway, so it was first for privacy. When Jefferson retires from the presidency, there are so many different passages where he doesn't have any privacy whatsoever, right? He's an enormous celebrity. And there are visitors galore. His daughter, Martha, says at one time, there were 36 stalls at Monticello for horses, 10 of which was for Jefferson's horses. And at times, all the stalls were filled by people who flocked to see Jefferson. Jefferson, people would visit and eat him out of house and home. And, the people complained, his servants complained, well, these people are playing off the largesse, the generosity of Thomas. They're eating his food, drinking his wine, eating all of his hay for the horses, right? I have a few quotes here. Edmund Bacon, who was the overseer, said, after Mr. Jefferson returned from Washington, He was for years crowded with visitors, and they almost ate him out of house and home. They traveled in their own carriages and came in gangs, the whole family with carriage and riding horses and servants, sometimes 3 or 4 such gangs at a time. There were times when Monticello was so overcrowded, all the beds they had in storage were in full use. At times, probably had to turn people back. Wormley Humes, who was Jefferson's personal servant at some time, talked about Monticello being packed with visitors for at least 8 months of the year. Now, there are people like Annette Gordon Reed who talk of Jefferson. I don't want to call it his stupidity, but at least gross ignorance for, I don't remember what word she uses, maybe selfishness or something, but I mean, he's not thinking in terms of his family. These people are eating him out of house and home, and he's going into debt because of that. Jefferson was an extremely generous man in the Christian sense of the word, even though he wasn't your typical Christian. Thought Christ was the Son of God and all that. But he believed in Christian charity, and there was also Southern hospitality. Part of the South is that when someone came to your house, you would put that person in. A lot of times there weren't inns. If you're traveling around Monticello, there weren't inns at which people could stay. So it was a politeness, Southern politeness to bring them up. A second aspect was financial. Jefferson, I'll read a long passage to you that Jefferson writes to Thomas Mann Randolph, his other son-in-law, in 1809, when he's about January 1809, he's still president, about ready to leave. He says, nobody was ever more determined than I was to leave this place clear of debt. But trusting to estimates made by my head and confident that I had the thing quite within my power, I omitted till too late the taking an accurate view of my calls for money. The consequence is that I shall fall short $8,000 to $10,000. I shall be able to get it accommodated for some time, and my Bedford crops of the last and current year will pay about $5,000 of it. So Bedford's a very profitable estate for him, unlike Monticello. An offer for my natural bridge tract, $1,600 to $2,000 within a 12-month, right? And so forth. So I have a book coming out on the natural bridge. This is the only book that's ever been written on the natural bridge from a historical perspective. There are a lot of books that have been written on the natural bridge by people working there who are doing a lot, talking about the myths and fables, trying to promote it. But it's the only story of Jefferson. And Jefferson never sells the natural bridge. He toyed with it at some point, but he doesn't. So he's thinking if I can sell the natural bridge, maybe get $2,000 for that, get $5,000 for my crops, blah, blah, blah. So the long and short of it is that during his presidency, as well as I do, he gave presidential dinners where he invited Republicans on one day, then he invited Federalists on another day. The idea was an idea, is to get the people in the Congress, he might say he's buttering them up so they'll vote for him any way he wants. No, he's trying to promote amicability. He knows that having Federalists and Republicans at the same dinner is not going to be very agreeable. Conversation won't be polite, but let's just bring people along and they can talk about what their constituency is interested in talking about. They can talk about whatever they want to talk about. We'll share food and wine, right? A very, very amicable sort of a venture, if you want to say. So he goes into considerable debt, about $10,000, and he thinks that, well, building a residence on my Bedford estate will allow me, even though it's going to cost me probably around $10,000 to build it, he's thinking be able to recoup that if I really watch closely, manage closely affairs at Bedford, right? So there's something a little bit weird about this notion of, okay, well, if I'm $10,000 in debt, well, I'll spend another $10,000 to build this estate. Hopefully I'll be able to recoup it. One might think there's a bit of insanity in that logic, but Jefferson apparently doesn't. I'll just leave it at that. A third reason, and this is something I've come up with myself, I believe this firmly, he's done with Monticello in 1806. This is the second phase of revising Monticello. He is, as many architects, Fisk, Kimball, and other people have acknowledged Jefferson to be probably the foremost American architectural influence in American architecture. He single-handedly brings classicalism to the United States. So for those of you who are going to college or visiting, you see the public buildings that are in classical style, right? With the pillars and the Doric, architecture and all the other types, the Corinthian and so forth. This is all due to Thomas Jefferson. You see it at our universities. You see it at our public buildings. Jefferson always needed to build. He's finished with Monticello. He's revised Monticello in some such way that it will accommodate Martha's family, Martha's kids. Martha's going to come move in with him at some point, and she will have problems with her husband, obviously. We don't need to get into that, but Martha is going to move in with her kids. He was hoping that Maria would have done the same, but she passes away. And he has to change it as well for another reason, because his beloved wife, Martha, has died, right, in 1782. And part of the reason why he took the role as minister plenipotentiary to France is to forget about his wife, because it was too painful. He built that residence for her, and it's too painful for him to come back to it just the way it was. He has to sort of redo it to accommodate the grandkids and to just change it around so it doesn't remind him of his wife. Got to have something to do. He's got to be playing. Jefferson likes to play. Is that agreeable? Does that work or no? Do you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add, and that's a great summation. I think the intent, and you hit upon this, that the intent was when Jefferson was going to pass away at a point, that Martha, his oldest daughter, would inherit Monticello, and Maria. I've also heard it the Southern way, Mariah. She would inherit Poplar Forest, which her father owned too, by the way, at one time before he passed on, Mr. Wales. But like you pointed out, 1782, she passes away due to complications related to childbirth. The only child of theirs that survives is, of course, Francis, who then inherits the property. And, he goes on to the New London Academy for some schooling and so forth and so on. So he was kind of entrenched there to a degree, but he, like you pointed out, he didn't live there that long in adulthood after Jefferson passes away. He stays there for a couple of years and then moves, of all places, to Tallahassee, Florida, or near it. So go figure.
Yeah, there's a statue there, if I believe correctly, but he hated the place. I mean,
he did.
We're going to talk about this last question, which I'm going to dump on you, but I'll handle question 4, and I talked about this with you privately. I think perhaps you could talk about question 5 yourself. His grandson hated the place. It wasn't the most user-friendly, right? It was an octagon. Yeah. He had to use an octagon pattern, and he's playing with Palladio classicalism. I talk about this ad nauseum in my chapter about the motivation and how he's structuring the building with regard, in some sense, for perfect symmetry. But so we'll talk about that when we get to the last question.
Okay. We're at 4 now, is that right?
We're at 4.
Introducing.
That's a good enough place to be anyway.
Okay, and I think that this one is relatively straightforward too. What does the letter tell us about Jefferson's relationship with his former son-in-law and his grandson, Francis Epps? So that's kind of a compound. One was his relationship with John Wales Epps, and secondly, with his, now I realize that Francis is very young at that point, but his relationship with his grandson, Francis.
Well, it's hard to say just what that relationship was. Francis, like you said, is very young at the time. He's not even, 5? I think he was born, 1801? And,
that's right.
September 20, 1801. He says not even 5 when it was written. And I'll answer that elliptically. I hate to say that, which means I'll beat around the bush. It bespeaks the question of Jefferson's relationship to his daughter, Maria. And I've thought about this quite a bit, and I've written about it a little. And there's no question that Maria was the odd daughter out, as it were. Jefferson, Martha looked like Jefferson. She was tall, not very attractive as female, highly intelligent like her father. Maria was much like her mother, shorter, very, very attractive from all accounts that we have, and perhaps not as intelligent from all indications. So she was pretty, but didn't have Martha's intelligence. Jefferson is naturally, even if he says nothing, he's naturally going to be attracted to Martha because she's older. There's also the fact that when Jefferson goes to Paris, he takes whom with him? Which daughter? Takes Martha.
The oldest one, Martha.
Yeah, and he leaves Mary at the time, called Mary. He leaves her behind. She's too young to travel, and he's right to say that. She's what, about 5 or 6 at the time. He takes her when she's 8. That's when Lucy Elizabeth dies while he's in Paris, and he says, well, you know, Mary's got to come too, whether she likes it or not. She doesn't want to come. So there's this sense of abandonment that she has, that, of course, Daddy takes Martha. She knows him when she's very young. But Daddy chooses Martha, doesn't take me. I stay with Auntie Epps at Eppington. I don't think, you know, she comes in and he's always coaxing her in letters to write more to him, and she is lazy, doesn't want to write him as often. Like his other daughter's more industrious. And I think there's this sense where she's always fought this thing that Daddy loves Martha more than he loves me. She's always had that complex. And she doesn't move in. She doesn't have any intention of moving into Monticello when she's married. They have a separate residence, right? John Wales and she. And you know, she's always reluctant. She never writes him long letters. She's always reluctant. She says, I love you and all that. But I think there's a sense of she's always felt. Oh, and secondly, when she goes to Paris, en route to Paris, she goes to England and she's met by who meets her? You remember?
Adams.
Adams.
The two Adams.
John and Abigail.
Abigail.
And Abigail takes her in, and she's, you know, she falls in love with Abigail and Abigail with her. And then when she comes to the port in France, before they go to Paris, Jefferson sends a servant to pick them up. And Abigail even sends, you'd think he could have come himself, but he was on a trip to the south of France and he got backlogged perhaps in his duties. What you think? Thomas, that's your daughter. Forget about your duties and go pick her up. Regardless of how backlogged he was, one thing I've learned from writing my book, Thomas Jefferson in France, is that he had a number of large things to do, but he wasn't occupied all the time. He had plenty of leisure time because there weren't too many. When there was work to do, it demanded his full attention, but there wasn't always work to do. So he had plenty of leisure time. And I almost can't forgive Thomas for not picking. So she feels abandoned. So to what extent does she share that with her husband? To what extent does that make a relationship between her husband, John Wales, and Thomas, you know, difficult? There's no indication there's any difficulties between the two. Jefferson, of course, says that he loved them and all that, but there's no indications that there are any difficulties. I don't know, but I always think that there was that wedge between Maria and Thomas, and I suspect that they had to have talked about it. Maria had to have talked about this with her husband, and it had to affect their relationship, his relationship with her husband, to some extent. Can we gauge that by the epistolary exchange between the two? I doubt it, though I haven't studied it. To be honest, I haven't studied their letters. I mean, have you come up with anything different?
No, not really. I mean, there's a big mystery to a lot of that, and I guess we'll just have to realize that we've come up to the limits of our knowledge on some of that stuff, at least for now, unless there's something out there that we're unaware
For now,
of.
it's just, look, we got about 9 minutes left, but I'm working on the letters between Thomas Jefferson and his son and his brother Randolph. And unlike other people, they are always looking. I'm more analytical. I look at the writings and see what I can glean from the writings, and there's a lot.
Sure.
My training is in psychoanalysis and my training as an analytic philosopher. There's much to learn just from reading the letters. So I've already exchanged with you some of the things that I've discovered just from reading those letters. So I think anybody who went and examined in the same way that I examine things analytically, the letters, you might be able to find. I doubt that I'll ever make that an object of my studies. If I'm going to do anything in my next book, it will be, and I'm sort of attracted to this idea, the philosophical letters between Jefferson and Adams. I think there's no greater correspondence between the founding fathers than Jefferson and Adams. And the philosophical letters are just cool. They really are cool. I mean, Adams is well read, highly intelligent. So is Jefferson. They have different political perspectives, and John Adams just loved Thomas, regardless of what happened between them.
Philosophical letters, certainly not in the Voltaire sense of the term, right?
Well, no, but I mean, in my sense, or in the modern sense, just in the sense where the discussing. I mean by philosophical, the discussing what we'd call philosophical today, or even issues that are issues of political philosophy, ethics. Does God exist? Metaphysics today, atomism, matter and void, Thomas Jefferson. Does God exist? Is there an afterlife? There's just so much philosophically to discuss between those two. Very rich correspondence. Now, the last question, we were going to sort of ad lib, and I'm going to ask it, I guess. I've written a lot on this. You are a docent. I pronounce the word differently because there's no hard C in Latin. So you guys should be saying docent, not docent, but that's the English language. What are you going to say, right? It comes from the Latin word.
We got to work with.
Doceo. Talk about the architecture. You take people on tours at Poplar Forest all the time, and I call it an architectural odyssey. It's an octagon. Tell us some of the things that on which you focus when you lead people on a tour. Especially focus on architectural aspects of the building. I mentioned to you that it's just not structurally. It's fantastic and amazing theoretically. It's not very good as a living quarters. If you can tell us something about that.
Sure. The overall design of the main part of the house, I see, mentioned, is an octagon. And the reason, what Jefferson said anyway, that the reason he was attracted to that style, the classical tie-in notwithstanding, so there's a certain intrinsic beauty that he sees, I guess, is the practicality of it. It gives him a panorama view of his entire estate, at least from that point. The butler brought the food up from the kitchen through the bedroom that his granddaughters, for example, would often use when they were down there, into the main room where they had the dinner. How many people have an architectural layout in their houses a day where the food goes from the kitchen through a bedroom into the main dining room? I mean, I guess there are arrangements like that, but that's kind of an oddity. Well, that's weird. What he had. It is. The asymmetry of the wing of offices as opposed to not having it on the other side. Because if you go to Poplar Forest, you'll see that on one side, there are paper mulberry trees that connect to artificial hills. Originally, both sides of the house looked like that. But what he had made was a wing of offices on one side. Well, now you got an asymmetry. Now that must have driven him absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and he had to want another wing. There's no question.
Exactly.
Now, someone suggested, we have a minute left, so we'll wrap.
Sure.
Someone suggested that the mounds, and this is only a suggestion, might have been patterned after Indian burial mounds or Indian mounds.
That's possible. Nobody knows for certain.
No,
but
we don't.
I guess the main thought there up until recently, now I'm understanding, is that it replicated Palladian architecture, at least in the general terms, and that's probably true. But more specifically, the Villa Barbaro created by Andrea Palladio in the early 16th century or mid 16th century. And whether that's true or not is, of course, up to cosmological debate among scholars and so forth and so on. So, I guess the bottom line there is we will never know, and we certainly don't have the definitive answer on that, but it certainly is possible. That's what he had in mind.
All right, give us the letter for next week briefly, if we can squeeze